This is the 6th recorded lessons for students in Mrs. Stout's biology classes at Limestone Community High School on Kingdom Animalia. And this marks our first recorded lesson on the vertebrates. First of all, we are going to start with our more primitive vertebrates. And a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are going to be their respiratory structures and their circulatory structures and reproduction. Some of the main things that make them living things, and specifically as animals. So first of all, the vertebrates are all still part of Kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, which we have already talked about. The chordates, remember, have a dorsal nerve cord, bilateral symmetry, pharyngeal gill slits. But this is going to be subphylum Vertebrata, meaning that they do have a true bony, sometimes made of cartilage, around that dorsal nerve cord. So they do have a protective covering around it. That notochord, remember, is the spinal cord that extends from the central nervous system, or the brain. There's also the pharyngeal gill slits, and for some of the vertebrates, they actually remain as gills. And as I said, for the vertebrates, this is on the dorsal or the back side of the body. This is true of all vertebrates. Our first group that we're going to talk about are the fishes. And yes, it's correct to say fishes if you're talking about more than one species or variety. So there's a huge range of habitats here. They can live from the open ocean all the way down to the deep. They can live in salt water to fresh water to brackish, which is in between water. Lots of variations in body appearances and appendages as well. We know they usually have fins, but not always. So we will start with the most primitive of those, and that's class Agnatha. These are your lampreys and your hagfishes, and we did see the hagfishes when we watched the deep video. These are a fish that are jawless, so they do not have a true bony structure of their jaw. They don't have scales and they don't have fins. So remember that scales and fins are not necessarily what define a fish. They do have skeletons made of cartilage, so just because they are a vertebrate does not mean that they have a completely bony skeleton. And you'll see this also when we talk about the sharks, skates, and rays. They do breathe using gills, which contain tiny blood vessels, and that allows for the diffusion of the oxygen back and forth across those membranes. They do reproduce sexually, which means you have to have a separate male and female variety, and they use external fertilization, which means that the sperm and the egg fuse together outside of the adult's body. They have a two-chambered heart, and that's going to be what defines all fish. This is all the way through the sharks. One chamber receives deoxygenated blood, which means it's the blood that's already been used, the oxygen has already been taken out. And then the second chamber pumps that blood directly to the capillaries on the gills, and that's where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. So it goes from the deoxygenated used blood to the second chamber capillaries of the gills to pick up more oxygen to keep going through the body. Now the difference between the hagfish and the lamprey, remember the hagfish is the one that we saw on the dead whale carcass. It has a slit-like toothed mouth. It's like completely rimmed in teeth, and they like drill a hole into the organism, suck the blood and the insides from the animal. And remember, this organism, they can like tie themselves in knots to be able to get a really good grasp on the food that they're trying to eat. Lampreys, on the other hand, are parasites. So that is a symbiotic relationship, remember, where the host is harmed in the process and the lamprey benefits from the relationship. So these organisms have a sucker-like mouth that scrapes away the flesh of their host organism, and then they like attach to it and suck out the prey's blood. So it's sort of like a tick, like a tick, but not exactly like a tick or a leech. Process is the same, but these organisms are vertebrates. Next we have class Chondrichthyes. Chondra, C-H-O-N-D-R, from Latin, refers to cartilage. So these are your sharks, skates, and rays. They have a skeleton composed entirely of cartilage. Their teeth are a little ossified. And these are all considered to be living fossils. And what that means is they haven't really changed much as the species that swam 100,000 years ago. Not only in behavior, but also in DNA, body structure, phylogeny, all that good stuff. They do have paired fins, which is a movement structure. It's defined as a fan-shaped membrane, and this helps them to have really powerful swimming and steering and balance in the water. Jaws eventually did evolve, which enabled the sharks especially to grab and crush the prey with great force. They're a very, very strong structure. And they do have a very fine-tuned sense of smell. Sharks have these pits like along the front of their mouth that helps them taste the water, sort of. It's more of a smell taste. This group has a lateral line system, and you will see this throughout the rest of the bony fish as well. And what it is on the sides of their body, there's a line of fluid-filled canals, and that's how they can detect movement and vibrations in the water. So if you've ever tried to grab a fish in the water with your bare hands and you try to come up behind them, they might not be able to see you, but they can feel those movements in the water, and that's because of that lateral line system. They do have the development of scales. Scales are defined as thin, bony plates formed from the skin. And this is actually how you can determine the age of fish. Yes, sharks especially, but any kind of fish. They have growth rings on their scales, kind of like that of a tree. The different shapes of scales help you classify which type of fish you're dealing with. If it's a diamond-shaped scale, those are going to be your more primitive, bony fishes. Your cone or round-shaped scales, so you can think of like rainbow fish. Those are going to be your bony fish, and then your tooth-shaped scales are sharks. In fact, if you ever get the opportunity to pet a shark, if you go one direction, it feels smooth, and if you go the other direction, it feels rough and can actually like cut up your hand a little bit, kind of like sandpaper. Sharks have 6 to 20 rows of teeth that continually are replaced as they lose them, and that's really important and beneficial for the sharks because they have to be able to grasp their prey. That's how they mainly hunt. And the teeth actually point backward into their mouth, which helps prevent the prey from escaping once it's caught. So that's an evolutionary advantage to the shark. Rays, on the other hand, have very flat bodies and broad pectoral fins on the side. Some rays have a sharper spine with poison glands on the tails, but not all. And some also have an organ that can generate electricity to kill their prey, to kill predators, and also to detect through electroreception food like buried in the sand. There is internal fertilization for sharks and rays, which means that the sperm from the male of the species is deposited inside the female to fuse with the egg. Our next group is class Osteichthyes. Oste, O-S-T-E, is Latin for bone. For example, your osteocytes are going to be your bone cells in your body. So this is what most fish are going to belong to, is class Osteichthyes. They do have a bony skeleton. They also will have those gills, the two-chambered heart, paired fins on either side, the highly developed sense organs as well. They'll also have that lateral line system. And remember, they will have the cone and round-shaped scales. This group is going to have a bony skeleton instead of cartilage, like class Chondrichthyes, which would be the sharks. And this is what has allowed the fish to adapt to different aquatic environments and eventually make the move to land. This group also has bony vertebrae, which provide flexibility. It's also really important in powerful locomotion. They have a swim bladder, which is kind of like a balloon, sort of, inside the body, found just below the backbone, and that's what helps them maintain their buoyancy and their depth in the water. This swim bladder can be filled with mostly oxygen or nitrogen that then diffuses out into the fish's blood. And then, as I said, they control their depth by regulating the amount of gas in the bladder. The African lungfish is a species that has a structure that actually allows it to breathe air. It can obtain the oxygen from gulping air, which then diffuses through its body. Reproduction is usually external fertilization, and when you think of salmon swimming upriver to spawn, the females release their eggs in certain areas, and then the male releases the sperm over the eggs, and they fuse together outside of the female's body, and that process is called spawning. This is really a game of numbers with spawning. The male and female will produce millions of eggs and millions of sperm, but really only a small percentage survive. Some types of species are live bearers, which means the offspring are born fully developed. An example of this would be the swordtail fish. Our next group is going to be class Amphibia. And these are going to be your amphibians. An amphibia means a double life. They do have a life on land and water. Most adult amphibians can live on land, but however, nearly all of them still rely on water for breeding because they do not have a protective membrane or shell around their egg. And so the eggs have to be laid in water in order to keep them from drying out. Fertilization is external, so the female will release eggs, the male will release sperm over, and the water has to be used for transporting the sperm. The frogs and toads do go through metamorphosis, which would be egg and then tadpole adult. It is a gradual process. The tadpole version has an aquatic habitat. It has characteristics of fish, such as the fins and gills, and also the two-chambered heart, just like all the other fish. But when it becomes an adult, then it has the terrestrial legs, it has lungs, and it has a three-chambered heart. So it's not just the external structures that change, but you can see the heart changes as well. And the heart actually helped make them move to land because walking requires more oxygen. However, the skin is more important than lungs for gas exchange in the frogs and toads. In a salamander, they will still have some sort of metamorphosis, but the young do resemble adults. They will still have gills and tail fin, but the adults don't. They also will breathe through their skin, possibly with lungs, but again, skin is going to be more important. Now, the way the skin works in order for it to be able to be breathable skin is it has to be very, very thin. This is why reptiles don't breathe through their skin. It's not just because they have lungs that work, because amphibians have lungs that work too. Reptiles just don't have the right type of skin. It's thick and rough. Salamanders also do not have claws. These organisms are defined as ectotherms. Ecto means outside. Therm means temperature. So the body temperature changes with the temperature of the surroundings. So we, for example, humans are endotherms. So getting a little bit further into the classification, we have kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Amphibia, order Anura are the frogs and toads. So they will have vocal cords, sound-producing bands of tissue in the throat, and this will continue on through the rest of the fossil record. Order Caudata are your salamanders. They have a long, slender body with a neck and tail. And then you have order Apoda. So A from Latin means without, and pod means leg. So Apoda. They don't have legs or limbs of any sort. They actually sort of look like worms. They do have eyes covered by skin, and they also represent the rest of the amphibian characteristics. So that is the end of the 6th recorded lesson for students in Mrs. Stout's biology classes at Limestone Community High School.